Well,
Okay.
thank you so much for inviting me and giving me that platform. I'm looking forward to a conversation. I will have a few slides to show and a few ideas to share first. It might take about an hour, maybe a bit longer. But also we can ask questions in between. It seems a small enough group. So I call the lecture The Four Dimensions of Architecture's Core Competency, which I think is important to understand that architecture is focusing on ordering social processes and that there are four dimensions of engaging with that, and not so much focusing on technical and construction issues. So I will talk about that, and but also I share some images to help illustrate what I'm talking about. Okay, so let me try to share my screen. Yeah, and then let's see if that works out. Start. Yeah, so is the first slide with the title of the lecture visible? Just need some feedback whether
Yes,
this, yeah,
yes, yes.
all good? Great, thank you. So the first thesis is social order requires spatial order. And that's why we can build up large societies, much larger than, small groups of primates who don't have a structured environment. One of the reasons, at least. And even grow societies to the scale of a city, and these cities are now kind of really, really large, but of course we also have a society much larger than a city, and we have things like the internet, and that's why I'm also interested in virtual cities in the metaverse. But the city is a gigantic sorting machine to order the total social processes. I think that's very important. We have millions of people trying to cooperate and interact for the sake of prosperity, basically. Then these interaction situations need to be distinguished, separated, connected. They need to be legible and recognizable so that we can self-sort into as many productive engagement interactions as we feel we need to be fully productive. There's a lot of degrees of freedom for self-managing that process, but we need that matrix of interaction mapped out for us in the city. Otherwise, we would have no orientation and no way to interact in a large society. So that's architecture's contribution to society is not shelter, which is at this stage, trivial, but ordering of social processes. Social processes which are based on co-presence in spaces. And so I'm distinguishing these four subtasks of the overarching task of ordering social cooperation. And so I'm using these phrases spatiology, phenomenology, semiology, and dramaturgy. So you can see here some of the translation. Spatiology, I used to call it organization, but spatiology shows more that it's maybe a science of organization. We need to be developing of the repertoire specifically. Phenomenology is worried about the visibility and perceptual tractability of these complex environments. Semiology has to do with the social meanings which we attach to all the different locations and forms we encounter. And then dramaturgy is the new concept I brought in recently, particularly in respect to metaverse spaces, which I believe are fully within the core competency of architecture, by the way. So when I'm talking about architectural ordering, that is ordering in physical space and in virtual space. So this dramaturgy has to do with the responsiveness and interaction potentials the physical environment offers to its users. So I've elaborated here a bit more. So spatiology is about to distribute, to separate, to connect. Phenology to make visible and perceptually tractable. Semiology to communicate the social situation. And that is a language and which has to evolve, which evolves spontaneously, but we can also intervene with and, let's say, enhance, and then make the built environment responsive to human action. That's the simple things like you can open doors and windows and shift screens and draw curtains and switch on the light and shift around furniture, etc. So that's important part, and that obviously is, there's enormous potential to upgrade this with computational empowerment. And in the internet and in the virtual spaces, this dramaturgy becomes much more important than is in the physical world. But I think the physical world could also, you have all these sensors and actuators, make dramaturgy or that interaction potential much enhanced. So that's been a research focus. All of these have been research foci for instance, AIDOL and various teaching arenas, as well as within various research groups in the and PhD projects in the office, etc. So the goals of these subtasks, and we have to think about it in terms of the contemporary condition, is complexity, first of all, to order the complexity of society spatially in ways which facilitate that complex unfolding and in a high productivity manner, and to have that complexity in a form ordered, and this order is complex and diverse, and maintaining legibility in the face of complexity is very important as well. So the raw complexity comes through the social processes, and architecture is involved in ordering that. But part of that ordering and to make it effective is that the end users and participants actually able to grasp and navigate that order. So I'm just throwing in some images of how these new architectural orders start to look like once they're not only organized but also articulated and have a phenomenology attached to them and a semiology. So these are just glimpses of city districts we've been involved with or sketched out, a cultural district, for instance, here in Istanbul, either with students or with ZHA. So there's both student work from AADOL, from Vienna, and other schools of architecture, as well as ZHA work. So just first to get an impression of the phenomenology, how these things start to look like and feel like, the degree of complexity we want to achieve, and maintaining a legibility so that I hope they're not appearing as overwhelmingly chaotic. And even if, as we scale up, for instance, intervene in London, we're trying to maintain that sense of complex variegated order in these projects. So here's a number of sketches where we also do this for virtual cities and metaverses, and again trying to find patterns and means and mechanisms to have build up complexity, but also maintain legibility in the face of this complexity. So just impressions of the results of some of these studies. And you can see that there's a sense to maintain global order and have a lot of variety, but have a gradual transformation of typologies, a coordination of heights, a logic of circulatory lines, etc., but aiming at something which is quite rich and complex and diverse in its offerings. And so some of these were virtual cities. This is a real this city district in Chengdu, which has a unity, but a lot of variety. So it's really about differentiating a unified approach, or offering unity across diversity and having an overall global order. This kind of splash or centrifugal forces implied, and then have starting to build some of those elements and focusing also on a lot of urban interaction spaces, not only the buildings themselves, but the order between the spaces and the in-between spaces as being part of the overall global order. So this is a lucky and rare occasion where we're designing a project of that scale, including all the volumes and facades and some of the lobby spaces and public spaces as well. But this approach of maintaining legibility in the face of complexity and having a more intricate relation between elements and parts and more variation is also happening on all scales within our architecture. So I won't describe individual projects, but we have a lot of the themes like connecting elements, gradual transformations, complex spaces with multiple vistas. You have intervisibility and in these complex spaces. And you can see also that our repertoire has a whole variety of materials, of morphologies. They all share this idea of an organic, differentiated complexity, which makes them fit to join also into larger complexes. And the ability to embed into existing contexts are also important. So we can't expect to always build cities from scratch. And I will come to this. There is an important element of this, which is what I call the compositional stance, where when it comes to the phenomenology, also the semiology of space, that we develop a quite ruthless formalism and bring quite different elements like staircases or ceiling ribs and shading elements under one formalism, so that they just coordinate their spatial gestures together and are not only technically conceived but compositionally conceived. And this is so that we have, for instance, lighting elements affiliating with seating and staircase elements. Even though they're very different functionally, they're compositionally and formally affiliated to underline one kind of spatial gesture or order or description, instead of cluttering up the space with difference, within uncoordinated difference, let's say. So this is under the heading of the project of Phenomenology. We have these concept of the compositional stance. Similarly, when you have elements, when you use technical requirements like tessellating a complex surface, sometimes it directly harmonizes with enhancing the plasticity and legibility of a space when elements become smaller in tighter curvature, and that enhances the grasp of that form. Anyway, I don't want to talk too much on this. It's just giving an impression about the language of architecture which is coming out of this. If we conceive of architecture in these terms of generating a complex spatiological order and then looking at means of articulating this in ways that remain legible and perceptually tractable. And then finally, I will talk more about how we can address also the social meanings attached to this, because if you have new and original morphologies and forms, it is important that they are systematically deployed so that they can generate associations with social meanings and become soon enough and quickly enough familiar markers and understood what is to be expected and found in the spaces which one recognizes. So some of our recent work. Okay, so there's a number of books I can recommend or I've published over the years. Relatively coherent set developing some of the ideas which I'm talking about here. And the latest book, Tectonism. I will not talk specifically about tectonism and the concept of spine, but you will find summaries of what I'm talking about here also in Tectonism. And what might be interesting about that book, the book which is coming out this summer, is that it will be also come out in Chinese language. So, but for the first time, one of my books will be in Chinese language. Okay, so I want to step back a little bit and talk about architectural theory as a very, very deep history, starting with Vitruve in the Roman period, who is a Roman architect and architectural theorist who's actually rehearsing the Greek, ancient Greek architectural theory, where there's no treatise saved or available anymore, but there must have been architectural theory discourse in ancient Greece, which the Vitruvian book is rehearsing. I'm starting here because this has also been very influential throughout the Renaissance and post-Renaissance up into the modern era, and I believe that contemporary architectural theory, and anyway, that's what I discovered. It can be made coherent, pretty coherent, with a whole kind of tradition of architectural theory. But so these three notions, which I guess you're all familiar with, utilitas, venustas, and firmitas, are the values or defining qualities of good architecture. And then there was what seems to be related notions, certain chapters or divisions in the classical books of architecture. There was the one on dispositio or distributio, meaning distribution. So that's what happens in plan view, how you organize the plan. That becomes what I later call, let's say, what I used to call organization and now call spatiology. Then they had a book on decus or decorium, which is the decoration and ornamentation, and then later on also discussed as the expressiveness of spaces, which you develop in the details and in elevation. And then there was also a chapter on construction. I mean, these books were both architecture and building engineering books. So they have a lot of detail on the technical aspects. But this is what you find in most classical books of architecture throughout the 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th century, etc. You'll find that in all the treatises of the Blondels or of some of even Semper and Sohn, etc. Now it seems that these might be aligned like this, that you have, but I'm critiquing this, that utility is a value which attaches, or you by which you judge the dispositio, so the distribution or organization of the space. But beauty, you discuss the decoration, and stability, you discuss the construction. It makes some sense, but I'm reordering that a little bit. But first of all, I want to say that since the differentiation of architecture and engineering, which started to happen in the 19th century, and I think was increased and more happened throughout the 20th century, and is by now, I think, complete, where we are no longer responsible for any technical aspects in our discipline, and it's all handed over to engineering, including the technical aspects of having interior fit-out elements or the facade. So it started with structure and M&E, and now it's all encompassing. So we have to leave that behind as part of our discipline. Of course, we have to be closely connected and collaboratively aware of the constraints we're working with, but that is engineering business. So we're left with utility and beauty on the one hand, and distribution and decoration on the other hand. And so when it comes to the values, utility and beauty, I think they're both necessary and important in still operative in architecture. So the functioning or dysfunctionality of spaces, but now with respect to social functionality, that's what we're discussing as architects. Engineers will be discussing technical functionality, and the code of beauty is whether these things are formally resolved or formally unresolved, and we need to understand what that means. This is something engineers are not dealing with. But anyway, so these two classical concepts are still very, very important in architecture. And so the way I look at these, and I'm not going to elaborate it too much, but beauty is not really an independent value which you could juxtapose or counterpose to utility and say, I rather go with beauty, that's more important to me than utility, etc. Or I said, I don't care about beauty, I'm focusing on utility. Beauty is in a sense just an intuitive appreciation, gut reaction to the high utility design. That's the way I think it is happening when we're in a well-functioned, stable culture where the useful becomes understood intuitively and recognized intuitively as the beautiful. So code of utility is a rational preference where you actually have to analyze. It's a manifest analyzed functionality, and beauty is the intuitive preference or the latent hidden functionality. They should be aligned, and if you always love and appreciate the dysfunctional, you should work on your predilections and your aesthetic values. You need actually a revolution in aesthetic values, a change in aesthetic values to align your appreciation to the useful. That's my theory of beauty, and these are important categories because not only as end users we have to make quick and intuitive choices, which space to enter, which building to maybe to look further, or which city district to move into or visit. And we can't analyze, we have to rely on our gut reactions and feelings, but if they are misaligned, then we are missing out on a lot of things which we consider ugly. For instance, if you have a nostalgic taste, this could get in the way of leading a very productive and fulfilling life. So now then we have dispositio and deco still, so distribution and decoration, and I'm not aligning them, but I'm setting this pair of concepts orthogonal to the pair of utility and beauty, because I believe that we can talk about not only a useful organization of the space, but also about a useful decoration, because this decoration has a task, the task of articulation, of making legible. And also the organization can be ugly or beautiful in a sense that we also can recognize maybe a dysfunctional, and we should develop a repulsive rejection of a dysfunctional organization. For instance, if it is way too monotonous and disorienting, we should kind of start to dislike it. And that's what's happening actually. So we can basically need to, these kind of value concept of utility and beauty need to be operating across these key aspects of the task of architecture. So we have useful organization and useless organization. We have useful articulation and useless articulation, which is, for instance, illegible or misguides us. And we have beautiful organization, ugly organization. We have, of course, beautiful articulation and ugly articulation. So that's the way I want to talk about this. And I used to break down these kind of task dimensions of architecture like this, where I said architectural order has these aspects of organization and articulation has a phenomenology and semiology. And now I'm saying basically I'm using these four concepts. Organization becomes spatiology because it's really the science of organization, and articulation becomes then both phenomenology and semiology, because these are aspects we have to differentiate. The phenomenology, as it were, is worried about, we need to reflect on the cognitive perceptual capacity of grasping and separating out of a very complex environment the features, the entities, the elements. And then a separate question is, what do these features, elements, and spaces which I can identify, what do they mean socially? And then the new category of dramaturgy. So I've shifted a bit the way I'm using this terminology and added dramaturgy, which I came to do that because of the metaverse, but I think dramaturgy exists in all physical spaces as well. So therefore, if you develop an architectural design project distinct from the engineering project, also distinct from the contractor's project, we're still involved with helping, coordinating for construction the set of drawings, because we're so interested in the final look and feel. We do this, but the contractor's project is, these drawings don't have the purpose for us to, let's say the design process is not using them so much for us to understand whether we are well ordering and well articulating. We only afterwards downstream need to assure that what we've ascertained for us ourselves, what we want, in my view, primarily through renderings, maybe VR simulations and animations, etc. That's the way we should design. And then when we know what we want and what works and what fulfills all the client's criteria from the architect's perspective, then we still should, I think, technically work with the technical teams and work it through to maintain the design intent, because this design intent is very nuanced and vulnerable to, in a sense, to distortion and to negation nearly if we don't control the final detail. But it's not, that is not our core competency. It's more kind of safeguarding work. So I think I'm also saying that these projects, they engage, and look at the third column, they engage the users on different levels. So the spatial logical project is about the distances and whether you have divisions or connections and pathways. It addresses the physical body, and it is passively interfering with proximities and so on. The Phenomenological project is interesting. It engages us as cognitive beings because it reflects our perceptual capacity, and the Semiological project, as well as the Dramaturgical project, addresses us as socialized actors, where we are not just, we have to reflect on the culture, on what people have experienced, what they're learning, what they can understand, all the situation they have to distinguish, and so on and so forth. So these projects are more rich and interesting in this way. So that's why I found it fascinating. In particular, the Semiological project presupposes the cognitive or phenomenological project, and of course it also presupposes the spatiological project. So it is the most advanced and evolved. And it's in a sense, the dramaturgical project is a further evolution of that. So there's a kind of, as you go down that list, the project presupposes the previous understandings and decisions, and is the most, let's say, the most complex and sophisticated. And now a step away a bit and going a bit into a more profound kind of understanding that this spatial order we are generating here is, I call it the long-term social memory, and it's a necessary material substrate of cultural evolution. So basically, the point here is that, and this evolution still continues, but it's important that it could never get off the ground without a built environment. We couldn't have a human society without a built environment, and without other design elements, not only for technical reasons, but for social ordering reasons. So if you know these village diagrams or village formations, you can have a more intricate social order, hierarchies, status groups, and you structure the social process and make that stable, but also you can accrue that. You can build, make larger structures, add rings to this, add things to it, cumulatively, gradually evolving a more complex order, which is without this both stable but also gradually transformable substrate, you wouldn't be able to evolve society with thousands of people with intricately division of labor and status hierarchies, etc. And so these kind of patterns of ordering, simple enclosures, and then grouping of elements, and then nesting them into a larger enclosure, they have been going on for many thousands of years. And then it is about creating an enclosure and differentiating activity situations. So also having a social memory, the routines of daily life and the process of societal reproduction, the rituals, the activities, the social status situations, they all kind of manifest in the built village. So, and the city is basically civilization. There's no, as we go build up larger and more complex civilizations, they need these larger built environments, they need cities. And it's interesting that when political theory started to think about the body politics or the social body as all the individuals which are integrated with some kind of overall social formation, which achieves new levels of prosperity, for instance, and new capacities collectively through cooperation, that this is kind of symbolized in this image of the sovereign integrating all the let's say the citizens. But what is interesting, if you look at the bottom here, that the city is actually the action. It's not the symbolic, but the real material manifestation of that society, where it also becomes transparent to society itself, and where society can interact with and then start at one point, quite late in the development, to more consciously intervene and manipulate the social order. And initially, you have the social order building up agglomerations, and then ring by ring, the way these cities form is quasi-natural, because these concentric rings are the most natural and efficient, and the circle is the most efficient enclosure, and then the concentric expansion is the absolutely natural and nearly automatic way of agglomerating. The unit size has to do something with the family unit and the activities, etc. And so these kind of diagrams, they then fit into various topographies. They sit at a river and potentially absorb a river. And so you have these forms, evolved forms. They're not pure circles because there is this degree of, let's say, phenotypical adaptation to environmental perturbations, but they then reproduce, and they have been reproduced in different civilizations, in different countries, in different times, over and over again, interestingly. And then in Europe, for instance, in the Middle Ages, you have thousands of these spread more or less equidistant across the agricultural landscape, and they're all very similar, and none of them they were all very similar in size at that time. And they had these concentric formation, and there are certain organs, the marketplace, the town hall, and the religious space. And only in the Renaissance this became a conscious effort. You had for the first time people drawing up the ideal city, drawing up the city and building it up in its element and with its plazas, but in a sense they just geometrically idealized and rationalized the diagrams which had evolved naturally. That's why they could still reasonably function. They weren't kind of arbitrary inventions, which would be difficult to expect to be useful. But this way was the acceleration. I mean, the other model has been, I don't know his Chinese history, but think about that. It is kind of rectilinear enclosures, and you have that also. You have the in the Roman city settlements, they had these kind of rectilinear foundations, which are military camps, and then out of that developed the city. Anyway, so this idea of social order requiring spatial order, not only on the global, on the city scale, but down, of course, to the individual building and courtyard and furnishing scale as well, because then you also need to structure the interaction process and marking out zones and establishing a configuration for certain interactions to take place, and it's not it's never a free for all, but it's always structured by these institutions which have embodiment in physical arrangements. So, and just briefly, so obviously these examples are from history. For thousands of years they were relatively simple and stable, and we have this explosion of development in the 20th century, and in particular interest in the last few decades, where we have an explosion of complexity and dynamism beyond even the modernist city. The modernist city is still relatively simple and not much more complex than the medieval city. Anyway, so I will go to a little bit what that means for spatiology, meaning for this kind of the tools we have of ordering this. I mean, so far we had concentric rings, and maybe we had rectilinear nesting structures or axes, and then what we had grids, and this is too simplistic and not enough. So what is interesting that it's from the late 70s, 80s on, there's been a kind of, when this process of post-fordist restructuring started to kick off, and you had an escape from these simplistic modernist grid cities back into adapting and overlaying into historic centers, you get this degree of complexity, and suddenly this is reflected in the discourse of architecture with this, for instance, radical idea of having multiple quite different ordering systems. For instance, a point grid, you know, a winding line, circle, triangle, and square as Platonic forms, all of them superimposed onto each other. So you get this idea of overlaying multiple ordering systems. Then each individual of these point grid markers, they are becoming some kind of transformational series, or quite a field of difference. Anyway, so this was a seminal project in the early 80s by Bernard Schumacher, and then a decade later nearly, we get an additional element, this idea of field transformations, a gradual transformation, squeezing, pulling, layering is still also there, but maybe a little bit suppressed. So this idea of gradient transformation was brought in by Eisenman, and I just show some sketches which we did with our students when I was teaching with Zaha in the early 90s at Columbia University. So we have this idea of multiple layers, and they follow certain global transformations like squeezing and densification, and then several layers are affected by the same inverted commas force field, and you get something which is different from the Chumi project. It is this kind of correlated, coordinated layering, and each system is also differentiated with gradient transformations, etc. So you get something richer and more, but at the same time with more ordering principles. So these are kind of sketches where we wanted to be. And we also, the first time we started, we were still working with hand drawings and then computer drawings to build this up quite chaotically. But this became a kind of project where we then looked at systematically how far can you, this idea of overlapping and intersecting, and also reductions, subtracting things and imprinting overlaps through subtraction. And then, a whole set of repertoires of ordering and this kind of spatiology project, where we have fuzzy sets, we'll come to that, but also this idea of metaballs, where you have not 3 or 4 things put next to each other, but they blend and bleed into each other with degrees of fusion. So what is important about these, you have ordering systems which are parametric, where you can have a variety of conditions and you can gradually increase, for instance, separation or fusion or densification like before, etc. So, and then you have these kind of color gradients or light gradients, or anyway, it relates to the logic not only of set theory, which is this, but of fuzzy set theory, which has also been a new form of mathematics, where whether an element belongs to a certain set is by degree. So the more centrally, you could visualize this by being more located more centrally, you're more within that set, and as you shift to the periphery, you're moving more out, and you also be in multiple overlapping sets, but not, but also with varying degrees. Are you belonging to one set? You belonging more to this set and less to this. So all of this set theory becomes parametric and variable, and these are simply on an abstract level much more sophisticated and nuanced ordering, and that would be possible in the city, where you may be belonging to several districts and several zones of influence, but with different degrees. And you might show that by location, you might show that also by articulation. You more, there's a kind of gradient systems of similarity and contrast. And this is in a world where we have each institution, each type of event comes with a lot of variations and a lot of degrees, types of mixity and nuance. And that's the social complexity we could describe in words, but we need to start spatializing by these new means. And also that when you're in an overlapping space, you can't have fixed walls. You have to have these thresholds articulated, maybe with a ceiling, with a step, a soffit, change of surface, so that when these different zones overlap, you can be simultaneously orient yourselves and be in several of them. And that's where also some of these boundaries could become, they're not solid and continuous, but they have degrees of permeability, porosity, closure, also relative to observers categories. So these are the studies we did 15, 20 years ago or longer, to tease out that new repertoire and also do that 3-dimensionally, and new metaphors like the swarms of fish for swarms of building in the urban, or elements in an interior, and looking at natural formations where you have that condition of gradual transformation, you have a lot of differentiation, but you also have unity of principle, and also of course there are functional drivers for this. So these are the kind of models we look at. We look at landscapes where you don't have harsh distinctions, but you have gradual transformation where a forest peters out or clearing is cut into it, but not dramatically rapidly, or river formations where it's not just one line, but these kind of ramifications with degrees of dynamism and so on. So that became inspirations for an urbanism which I believe has a higher level of intricacy and complexity and also legibility. So this becomes the organizational project, the spatiological project informs that, but also quite interestingly lends itself to, but it needs to be a separate project to control, lends itself to remaining legible. So these are studies we've done with Zardid architects over the years and the various teaching arenas. And here, when you look at three-dimensional model formations, we can no longer say this is purely spatiology, this is already spatiology overlaid with some kind of attempt to at phenomenology at least. And we also know what these types of elements mean. So the semiology is also already applied. When you come to full city models, all the dimensions are coming into view. And dramaturgy in the city would be the ability to move through and to manipulate one's perspective and gain a kind of handle on it, the way the space, for instance, responds to one's change of perspective. But also simply which streets can you cross. You can switch on the light, inverted commas, in the city square. These are glimpses of dramaturgy even in the urban. So these are, I think, attempts to tease out that repertoire and test legibility just by looking at these and navigating these and trying to find yourself in your own kind of model and drawing. And you can see, for instance, the swarm which exists and in a very large range from very tiny to very large, and then you have also kind of negative Boolean swarm cutting out. Anyway, so that is, let's say, spatiology already migrating towards phenomenology. And now I want to just explain a bit how one works on the aspect of phenomenology. So I'm using this project because I like it. You have, you say, if you look in the background of that image, you see these sheds and houses and pieces of infrastructure. They don't have they seem shapeless. You look at this and you look at it again, you can't remember anything, you can't find anything easily. It all looks the same and disparate. And so if you imagine to put two car parks, a train station and a bus station into this, it could totally be invisible, inverted commas. And here the attempt is to make this conspicuous, to work on making these parts articulate that they belong together, these two car parks on two sides of the road, plus a train station and a bus station, that they all belong together and form one unity, one functional unity. So they should also be legible as compositionally an integrated, unified space or element. And the number of things we've done, we have introduced curvature to draw this together. We've introduced this distinction of concrete and tarmac to pull together this car park and cut through the road to bring it together with the train station. The train station very kind of conspicuously makes a cut into the roof, and the buses equally, and you get something highly legible and conspicuous. And we're imposing these kind of formal moves. They are not technically functionality, although they function technically perfectly, but they're motivated by social functionality and specifically in orientation and legibility functionality. So when we then choose light posts, we could have done any kind of light posts. We use something which harmonizes with these lines, and also we have a gradually increasing of height of these line posts, and then we affiliated them with the columns under the roof, so they're sweeping into the station and also these cuts in the ceiling and light elements here, they affiliate with these demarcations. So they have a continuous swarm formation made from parking demarcations, light posts, columns, and light slots on the ceiling. And also, again, the formation of that whole concrete ceiling is blending with into the ground surface, and you get a very clear, I think, legible condition. And when you then say sample a photo, an image of the ceiling of that train station and put next to it a photo of the surface of the car park, there's a kind of puzzling similarity, and you say, isn't that anti-functional? Shouldn't we optimize for technical? So these very different things shouldn't look alike. Well, I disagree with that. First of all, there's so many options to make a perfect technically functional light post and ground surface that could be concrete or tarmac. And similarly here, so we can be perfectly technically sufficient and then focus on our core competency. You know, the engineering constraints are dealt with, and now we're doing our compositional and articulatory work to drive phenomenology home. And that's what is, I think, the architect's job is so different from the engineer's job, because if the engineer would just do it, he wouldn't even find the station in the city, right? And he wouldn't know that these things belong together. And so that's the kind of phenomenological project. And then realize I'm running late with my lecture. And the semiological project is then, okay, would be also here that you actually recognize a car park by the lines. So that's maintained here because you're actually picking up the car park lines. But then you also recognize the station through its element, etc. So semiology means architecture must speak. It must not only be visible in the sense of perceptually tractable, but it also must communicate the specific functions. And that's maybe relatively trivial in a train station, but less so trivial in a complex mixed use complex, or in a corporate headquarters with many different departments, spaces, types of spaces. And therefore, if it becomes complex, we need and some of the traditional society, you know, Beijing, or you know, a palace, governing palace in the Chinese emperor is a highly intricate and complex social organism. So you need quite a lot of differentiation of situations and protocols of interaction, access, restrictions, etc., etc. So we do have that. And we have the semiology comes in that you understand the typologies and what they invite you to do, how you congregate, who is sitting where, etc. I mean, I can't read that, but also the costumes, the way design, for me, all the designers to participate. This is not only urbanism, but also architecture, interior design, furniture design, also fashion design, as well as these smaller industrial design elements, all the cutlery and pots and pans. You know, whether if you make a party at home, whether you put a tablecloth and bring out the family silver, is quite a different sense of this occasion and situation than just, you know, throwing some cardboard plates on an undecorated table. So these situations are defined through these design choices, and that's very important to nuance and to characterize, so that you know what you're entering into. And when you then come with the jeans to such a dinner party, you know you missed the point, or you might not like to be part of the situation. You can read that and immediately get out if you see the tablecloth and silver, or see somebody walking around with a tie. You exit or you enter. So you need to understand the situation by reading all these cues, and that's a semiological project. And it's quite interesting that when you go to traditional societies, you can see that the emphasis on structuring a situation and decoration, as well as fashion, this wasn't flippant choices. They're very, very important, and they have an enormous amount of investment in intricacy and pressure and value. I mean, the cost of these decorations is enormous with respect to the kind of bone-breaking poverty of these communities, but they invest in this because it's an absolute sociological and a social functioning necessity. Otherwise they wouldn't. So they would, tribes, that's not an excessive thing. Of course, it's a highly important condition. So, and you find that everywhere. And it's interesting that you'll still have that. And that's the aspect of spatiology, where you're kind of ordering the court procedures through where the defendant sits, the lawyers, the prosecutors, the jury, the judge. There's this kind of structured space. We don't have many so formally and rigidly structured spaces anymore, but the tradition was full of them. But we still have this, and we kind of understand that it's important. And here things have kind of a heavy burden of functioning well, and people are nervous and pay a lot of attention to ritualistic details. And then you have still the costumes. I don't know when they will disappear in England. It's interesting, it's curious. So it seems to be still that kind of grasping who's in charge and what's the various roles still makes sense. We still have residues of that. And we have this, of course, in all cultures. There's not a single culture where this kind of ornamental heightening of personas and differences isn't taking place. And that is then also translates, of course, to the buildings, the spaces, the exteriors, where you have maybe physically and technologically not such a huge repertoire to make these distinctions, and they use more or less the same kind of tent, but then you inscribe them, these graphic articulations, and that's semiology. And this difference, I think, is quite striking. The differentiating the social order is also the groups are much larger, and you need to understand who is in charge and who is married, who is not married yet, and etc. What's the ranking and hierarchy and tribal. And that's why I think it's quite curious that in communism, when this was, let's say, bleached out, I think there were still nuances and ways of recognizing. And then you have, when I talked about this transformation of a Fordist society, where you have this kind of equal living standard and mechanical mass production and so on, and not also in the West, the working class and so on, and we would dress more like it evenly, because there was also mass production fashions where everybody had to wear more or less not only buy the same car, the same house, the same washing machine, the same packaged holiday, but also more or less the same dresses. And then in post-fordism, you have that explosion of, let's say, identity, differentiation, articulation, and so on and so forth. And now we're in a totally different world where you have to, you have to kind of navigate a very, very complex social realm and trying to fit in by using these repertoires and express yourself. But the similarly would be with restaurants, bars, clubs, spaces, office spaces. I mean, Google and Facebook and so on, how they kind of distinguish themselves or want to break away from stereotypes and articulate their identity. That's a huge topic, and we are also dabbling in. And so that's semiology basically, and you can do that in many different ways. The same differentiation of these chess icons could be many different ways. So it's quite a rich creative project. How you would do that, how you would emphasize particular elements, let them pop out more, how blend them in more. Is it more homogeneous or more differentiated? Is it etc. Is there a system to it? And anyway, so I'm interested in the fashion system. It's part of the design discipline. It's part of the discourse of an expanded notion of architecture. Anyway, and I think the same is when you look at space, where you're reading the rules of different zones, different parts of a space have different rules. For instance, in a football field, there's where the goalkeeper has its reach and use its hands, where you get certain penalty conditions, where so you get these demarcations, and so this kind of ordering of the process, when it becomes complex, we've been always responsible for that social functionality, and delivering this increasingly through communicated demarcations rather than physically through walls with locks and barriers and gates. That's a sign of social progress. We have this kind of open shopping malls, or we can roam around everywhere, or open bureau landschaft, or etc., where it's not about separating everything physically, but having everything intervisible, and then you need to read the thresholds, understand the situations, etc. And you need to fit in. So the interaction, that's what I'm coming to. We need to imagine not only the space, but we need to imagine the players, the different types of players in the social interactions, and how they would respond when they cross a threshold, how the situation changes for them. And this is what we start to study under agent-based pragmatic semiology. And just very briefly point to this, so that this patch changes, the action changes. Unfortunately, they're all gray squares, so then you should be articulated better. And we start to potentially have layering, like many different situations, perhaps, like here, and have several audiences of several situations. And then you can also play across the other's field, but you have to pay attention to your field. So how do you filter that out? That becomes a phenomenological project. It's also a semiology project. Anyway, so I've written about that, and you can use the traffic sign system, is of course full of semiological elements, and you can build up a grammar, so you can have the combinatory power of articulating many things through combining features, and as if combining words into a sentence. You can define ground surface with partition articulation and ceiling articulation, materiality, color, degree of transparency, lighting. All these are, in a sense, like different registers which you can combine to articulate a complete, nuanced, differentiated situation. Like in a university campus where you have different departments, you have seminars, lectures, libraries, quiet spaces, one-to-one spaces, office spaces, and they have to be, these need to be recognized across all the different departments, but you have to also distinguish the different departments, and then how they're grouped and subgrouped. Anyway, then you get something quite complex, and then in a way we don't have that realized, but every pattern and shelf form and exterior articulation and ground surface articulation and furniture form means something specific. So you know in which department and in which situation you are, with what kind of people, whether it's a student or teacher territory, so on. You should, in theory, be able to read this intuitively, even, like we now no longer have to kind of think very hard when we take in language. We could take in a very articulate visual language and intuitively grasp all the dimensions of knowledge we need to perform perfectly and beautifully. And then we develop a system of these, a system of similitudes and contrasts. So you can see that these pavilions have shared a similar geometry but different material. These share material but have different geometry, and these again share geometry but have material difference, and these have material similar and geometry difference. So you can make these networks where you share dimensions and aspects with different spaces, and therefore you can connect these, you can read that off, because meaning is ultimately all the other things you connected with. And I'm running a bit of time, but there's an attempt, it's actually a Chinese group of students, to make this, build up a semiology where you have bound business, the bound spaces, which are closed spaces, are business, the unbound are the leisure and circulation spaces, and then you have two types of business spaces. The workspace has these concave amoeba form, the convex are the meeting zones. It's pretty obvious. Then you can vary them quite dramatically, but then you can also morph between them. So these are parametric semiology projects. You can intersect to work to generate work, to work to generate meeting, meeting and work to generate meeting. You can nest them. So there's a grammar and aggregation potential, and you can make a gradient bleeding actually open up the bound unbound into a gradient, enhances with colors. You can make kinetic transformation, you can make overlap, and you can repeat these formations. The space form repeats in the table form. You know that you're on a work desk and not a meeting desk. And you can make these boundary formations, either walls, ceilings, steps, and you can get something quite diverse and rich and legible. And then we can simulate the interactions with agents on top of that. And realize we have to assume obviously that the agents are self-selecting. So you have these 4 cubes, gives the chance to have these kind of groups and pairing up, but they also have to understand that's what is expected. So it's not just pure geometry. So you have to learn and be socialized into this. So there's a kind of learning and element, but there's also a kind of structuring element in the space. Anyway, so this is simulations and animations we've done with students for many years, and we also have in the meantime professional projects. So when we want to visualize the social meaning of these spaces, we want to okay, that doesn't work. We want to show the interaction and the difference between a formal meeting and informal gathering, the types of agents. We differentiate them in different classes and how they make sense of the situation and how they use the situation. So that's where we bring the meaning, which we can write about and talk about. We're trying to bring the meaning directly into the model through these simulations, and then we can also measure the quantitative, the number of encounters, the number of types of meetings, the number of encounters across status levels or departmental levels, etc. So I finally wanted to actually bring in the dramaturgy element, where we basically presuming complex spatiology, phenomenologically tractable, semiologically, let's say, elaborated, and they have signified meaning. And now on top of that, we allow transformational processes, activation, interaction potentials for users, or also independent AI empowered furniture generating and inviting and interacting with users. So this is the kind of dramaturgy element which we've been trying to look at. There's actually a physical model, by the way. So students are quite ingenious with that. And the idea of doing this in the physical, we've studied so many times, and you have interactive art with actuating and responsiveness in many art galleries for years and decades, but not a single project out there in the real world. So that's why my belief at the moment is this metaverse will deliver that, and we can work it through in the metaverse, and then we'll bring it back into the physical. And there's a number of projects we've done where a lot of things, not only furniture, but facades and elements, etc., open up, close. This is dramaturgy, when you can manipulate the space as you move or point or sit down, etc. So this is wait, I jumped to the next one already. Some of the few final renderings to show what we're trying to do. These transformational possibilities. And we were hoping that we can and of course each of them are highly legible, they're also highly significant, but they're also responsive, and there's this kind of dramaturgy aspect, and there are many of them. I feel I'm rushing to a little bit through them because I want to leave some time for discussion, but I think there is enough time still. So these social situations are inviting particular forms of engagement with different number of people, with degrees of casualness, etc., and that this could be malleable. So you have this anyway in the contemporary condition, particularly in the workplace. You have this insatiable craving for flexibility to change situations. Otherwise, you would have to build 5 spaces with this configuration, and people would move from one space to another. You can maybe overlay them in one space and have that kinetic transformation. And on furniture level, it's easier. On architectural scales, it's a bit harder. But we actually have tried also something, studies for Facebook in a big kind of open space where they want to gather flexibly all the remote workers, etc. So there are many of these studies, and they're all pre-metaverse enthusiasm, but now these all migrate into the metaverse because I think we can instantiate them there. Oh, wait, yeah. And what's important is that there's always the human figure, always visualizing and working through and understanding the utilization, the social diagram which emerges as these things transform. And there's a strong difference between a stand-up table and a sit-down situation. One is more stable, the other one is more fluid, more communicative, more outreaching. Sit-down is more inward-looking. So these nuances are all kind of encoded and nearly in these elements, and you can kind of move through these. Wait, no. And there are many of these projects. Over the years, I've done this several times. Also, mostly AADRL. We've done similar projects in Vienna as well, and we've done, and I'm not showing this, we've done professional work as well on the agent-based simulations with hundreds of agents, but we haven't done a lot on the kinetic transformation. So we're just starting to do that now in our metaverse. Okay. Maybe this is the final animation I want to show. It's also important for me to have outdoor spaces activated and that the porosity of the building opens up and closes. So what's interesting in metaverse, you don't have elements, you don't need to, but you want to have differentiate degrees of publicness, degrees of openness, or degrees of closure and privacy. And the indoor-outdoor trope is an interesting one to work with in the metaverse as well. Okay, that goes on, and just to say that the intent of this, I mean, that's why we also, not with students, which is illustrative and explorative. In the firm, we have serious measurements of encounter frequencies, of conversion of encounters into communications across within departments, across within status levels, and so on. So in the end, the attempt this is all about kind of making our lives more productive, making our days more rich, where we participate in more situations, meet more people, and all of this is, I think, satisfying, makes us happy because we want to progress, and this is just a big prosperity engine I think we're participating in. So this is not a spectacle. This is not for looked at with the eye of a connoisseur or artist. This is really business spaces. That's why I like to work with business spaces, where we know that this is going to be, they will invest and they have the money to invest if it generates the productivity they want to let's say achieve. And if the Google campus or Facebook campus brings thousands and thousands of people together into a space, they want to maximize knowledge transfer, communication, inter-awareness, collaborative potential, and bringing out these products, super high value products, which they can distribute to billions, 3 months earlier, half a year earlier, or before the competition, that has an enormous value. And so I just want to make it clear that this work is it's really important to see it as also as generating an enormous amount of economic value. And that's non-trivial because life, we are still on this kind of prosperity trajectory. Unfortunately, in Europe, we have stagnation, but I want to see degrees of freedom and self-directedness and choosing when and how much to work, etc. That all would be a much more wonderful and empowering life based on productivity gains, which we now more and more will see in this knowledge sector. Just one thing, you know, agriculture productivity keeps rising and rising and rising because of agroscience in cities, in labs, integrating with the tech sector, etc., etc., etc. And that goes for all our aspects of life. So that's what this also means, and importantly. Okay, with that, I want to close. Thank you, and we can discuss. Right, I want to see how I can stop sharing.
Thank you, Patrik. So thank you so much for guiding us from ancient Rome to metaverse.
Look, the same. I hope this all becomes physical reality. But I think we will live in two worlds simultaneously, virtual and real. And there's a whole other lecture where I'm talking about how to integrate these two is another interesting topic. But you can look that up on some of my other lectures.
So before students' questions, you mentioned that construction and the structures separated from architecture from Renaissance.
No. So it was still integrated, and all through the also the 16th century, 17th century, 18th century. In the 19th century, it started to separate. In France, post-revolution, you had the polytechnics versus the Beaux-Arts kind of institutions. You had architecture and starting to occur in two types of university. And of course, in the polytechnic, they were still doing architecture. You actually have, but in both, they still did both. But it started to show there's a kind of differentiation of another discipline. But it took another 100 years. So I think only in the 1950s, 60s, 70s. I mean, even when I was a student in the 80s, it was more integrated, much more integrated than now. And we had to. It was. For many small projects, the architect had to do everything. I had to learn calculations and instructional calculations, calculations and so on. So it's more recent that this is separated, but it has now fully separated in the last kind of 30 years, I would say. But still, it's important to realize that I love the collaboration with engineers, and engineers research and the frontier is inputting a lot also, and is congenial with a lot of the digital design tools and research in architecture. I can see there's a symbiosis, but when it comes to professional work and final responsibility and the priorities and criteria of success of one's work, there's a very strong difference. And I think we need to recognize that. The specialization has moved on, and I think it's very important in specialization, because what you focus on and the responsibilities are very distinct, and it's very difficult to have the same persona, the same type of education and concern, and to have that responsibility and capability, bridge that gap is, I think, nearly impossible now. So you rely on collaboration, close collaboration. But I'm saying this because a lot of architects they lament this. They think, oh, I wish we had more control over fabrication and construction. We need to gain control back. or when they talk about their work, the most rational elements are the engineering elements, so they only talk about the engineering things, like Foster saying, well, how does my building weigh? I'm so happy that, you know, I have a very light building, or we focus on sustainability criteria, which are oftentimes, I mean, architecture inputs this, but they're calculated and measured and dependent a lot on the equipment brought in by engineers. So architects talk about this too much and don't recognize that they're no longer responsible for these aspects. They're responsible for integrating these constraints, and they will obviously can't avoid doing that. But they don't know the details. They don't know, and they don't actually have responsibility for the structural integrity of a building. Just to clarify. I mean, I'm mentioning this because to focus, you know,
Okay, clear.
on our specific competency, so where we should focus on. I'm saying this because a lot of my generation of architects, they got a lot of involved in, let's say, doing proto engineering within our discipline because they were so fascinated with robotic fabrication, technical issues. They were fascinated by the new, you know, the new finite element analysis and structural topology optimization tools. And I think it's all wonderful and fascinating. So they kind of, but they forgot, I think, or it's time now to focus and emphasize social functionality, because otherwise we're only discussing the artifact, the physical artifact, its efficient production, and we can't even explain why we're interested in complex geometry to begin with. We can say, oh yeah, look, isn't how wonderful, we can now 3D print, or we can make all these elements different, and we can make this wonderfully complex architecture, but there's no conception, there's no justification, or when you ask why should we do it? We can, it's still more expensive. Why should we do it? There's no answer, because there's no discourse on social functionality, which describes the necessity and social functionality of these, for instance, curvature. And there's another lecture, the superiority of the curve when it comes to the Phenomenological and Semiological project, particularly the Phenomenological project, is something. I mean, of course, some structural, some curvature, etc., is also structurally efficient, and that's a beautiful congeniality. But a lot of the it's interested in parametric architecture and parametricism. It's not fully motivated by technical efficiencies. And then it becomes vulnerable to be dismissed as excessive and expensive and anti-utilitarian. And the utility is a key category, social utility, not only technical utility. All right, sorry, I'm speaking too much. I should let questions to be posed.
Uh, 我现在有这个问题吧。黄老师开始。这样说。
Hello, Patrick.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, very well.
Hi. I'm Jiatong Huang. I'm the assistant professor of Beijing Jiatong University.
Okay.
I think first of all, thank you for this amazing lecture. Yeah, I was totally like shocked by this amazing lecture, because it seems like I walked through the history of both philosophy and also the history of architecture in just 1 hour and a half. So yeah, so first, thank you so much. So actually I have two questions for you. The first of all is like, you mentioned the four aspects of this architecture. So And so, first of all, you mentioned like the spatiology and also from the Vitruvians of the philosophy and also the Peter S. Autonomy. So I think now in the era of AI, especially the hot topic of AIGC nowadays, many architects and the scientists are researching on the spatiology, and also I think maybe the semiology of architecture using by the AIGC. That it seems now like AIGC can help a lot, maybe semiology of architecture, but for the spatiology, phenomenology, and also dramaturgy, I think maybe there is also still a long way for AIGC to reach a level of a mature architect. So I wonder what's your opinion on the limits of AIGC and how long, and what's the limits of AIGC to reach maybe the 4 aspects you mentioned before.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fascinating what you're saying. I agree that there's I don't think the discipline of architecture is well equipped to deal with semiology because they haven't been worked on, and it was developed initially in the 60s and 70s and then disappeared more or less. I'm kind of trying to reinvigorate this, but it's true, in the AI tools can help, can come in. And I'm actually, for instance, when you could have obviously feed images into a system and let it learn. They need to be labeled, and you can then have recognition tasks done by AI to recognize that whether this is a residence or an office or etc. But also within buildings, they learn to distinguish, tables, chairs, cupboards, carpets. They can, and we have, the semantically tag and semantically parsed scenes, complex scenes. And that's an interesting capacity. So we actually have one of my PhDs working at Jiatong University. We're working on trying to operationalize for the first time this phenomenological project, meaning the perceptual tractability, how easy it is to, within a complex scene, to find and recognize, for instance, escalators, or to distinguish between certain elements in a complex space. And so yes, we're using AI to train up on a set of spaces, and then test out how the increase in complexity makes that harder, lowers the recognition rate, and increases the time of completing tasks. And that's true, there's a kind of interesting trade-off between complexity and legibility. But then there are different designs, even though we have to develop a measure of complexity, and then we have different ways of articulating that. And then we can say that there's a number of designs, they have differential legibility measures with the same complexity. So you can start gearing up and to this headline of mine, maintaining legibility in the face of complexity, and you can make that a design decision, help you with a design decision on certain things. And because the complexity is something which is the diversity of offerings, for instance, in atrium, how deep the shops are and how many situations you can generate, and also a richer way of setting up escalators. Instead of only in one direction, they move in 2 directions, and then they're becoming harder to distinguish, and so on and so forth. So we're just starting to work on this. And yes, you could do that. I'm just talking to a cognitive scientist, David Kirsch, friend of mine. We wanted to set that up also for more global gestalts of a certain atmospheric sense of a space. What kind of people you might find, what kind of situation and demeanor and sociality you might find, is it's how informal or formal or easygoing it is, etc., whether so we this is possible. And immediately when we're thinking about it and setting up empirical tests and questionnaires, we're thinking of AI. The limitation here, though, is that these AI systems, when it comes to the semiology, they obviously rely on a current familiarity and current features, furnishers, and types of entrances and windows, etc., on an existing kind of semiosis which evolves spontaneously, and then you're kind of locked into with that, maintaining within that familiarity. And what I find, and that's interesting, that's okay, and that's useful, but how do you escape from that? So what my project is not about only to make something legible within the context of an existing understanding, which will guide architecture to reproduce the familiar. It would allow something which, for instance, the tech companies are doing, where they're combining familiar elements in unusual situations. They don't want their office to look like offices, and then they put in features and elements and colors which make, which look more like a kindergarten or like a billiard hall or a fun place. So, but it's also not what I'm aiming at. That they're just recombining the familiar features to generate a new identity. So that's the limitation, I think, of AI, and wanting to go into new territory. That's why I want to synthetically build up semiotic systems. Also, the other reason is, and you got glimpses from this in this one project I was talking about, a grammar, building up a grammar and building up a more coherent language and complexity, which has more nuance than you can get now, and more systematically. So that still remains an ambition for further research, for further project development, where I don't see at this point how AI can substitute itself for that. It might. you might be able to, through recombination, you get interesting results, and you can. But I think what I'm at is a systematic rebuild, also, not only a game of recombination.
Yeah, so like for a fuzzy system of architecture, so maybe it's difficult for the AI to understand, I think, even for human.
That's the thing. How do you, at the very frontier of creation, yes, we're using it, you can create new stimulating things, but it's maybe if your ambition is to be more revolutionary or more systematic, let's say, then at the moment we don't have the tools. But I wouldn't make I suspect whatever project of a creative project we will engage in from now on, we probably find ways of integrating AI in various capacities. But we have to also recognize the limitations, let's say, of being building on a lot of, particularly when it comes to semantics, familiar features and familiar tropes, and what they've ingested is obviously all in the past and not in the future.
Oh, thank you. And I have another question. Please allow me to. So we all know that the Zaha now entering the world of metaverse, and you have published articles and speeches about metaverse. So in the metaverse, maybe the guidelines of the students are maybe not working anymore. So we have no limit of structure, and maybe we can ignore the utility, some of the principles before.
Well, no,
what do you think the role of architects like to have like less limits than the real world?
Well, my view is, first of all, I mean, the categories utility and beauty are very abstract in general, right? And they been particularized in each era differently. So in the different epochs, and that's the way we also can distinguish styles of architecture aligned with various socioeconomic or cultural epochs, the ideals of beauty and the forms which were considered beautiful and were quite different. And similarly, the criteria of utility were quite different. So these are just as abstract categories. They although have a huge longevity and defining this field. The particular instantiation is then particular to the time, and that's why we need, as architects, understanding the requirements of our time, and it might require that the spaces and the spatial configurations change. For instance, you bring in a dramatic concept like overlap and layering or gradual transformation, which violates, for instance, the classical canons of symmetry and proportion, of unity, of composition, also of modernist, let's say, separation and repetition. So you're violating, and you need to, these are new ordering capacities and new social functionality and legibility opportunities. And then you need aesthetic revolutions. Then you need to start to fall in love with these forms, and because they work well and they facilitate the beautiful situations and interactions. So these become aesthetically positive values, and the previous ideals of beauty become negative concept. They become kind of the ugly, if you like, or the and so that's important. And similarly, so these categories also of spatiology, phenomenology, semiology, and dramaturgy, they're equally valid in the metaverse. But also utility and beauty are valid in the metaverse, because we still need, on one hand, distinguish the functional from the non-functional, but we also need to have the category of beauty, because we need to also attune intuitively to this, so that we can not always measure and analyze the situation, but we instantly sense and feel and be drawn to a situation which at least has a higher chance to be the functional. So we need these categories, because these categories coming out of our kind of subjectivity and our the way our cognition and sensitivity functions. You always navigate the world aesthetically as well, and it's important, and you can't avoid it, but also it is highly functional, because you come to a space quickly with hundreds of people, you have to quickly sense through their demeanor, fashion, who might be a good fit, congenial. You need to guess, and you need to follow your emotions, who you're attracted to and who you're not attracted to, also when they speak and their demeanor. So but also the spaces, what you're attracted to, and that's very important. And you have that in the metaverse. Like, it's unavoidable. And as designer as well, when you work on your drawing, you kind of doodle, or you do lots of options, and you select the one you find you're more attracted to. You just need to make sure that the underneath you conditioned what you like. There are some principles, and that these are sound guiding, that you can rely on it, selecting the better version. So as a designer, it's also very important when you work that you have aesthetic criteria and aesthetic sensibilities, and that they match up with the, let's say, functionality sensibilities. Now, when it comes to the metaverse, now you can see metaverse, they import everything which you find in reality relatively one-to-one. It's very familiar architecture and buildings, and maybe a bit more reduced in polygon count and abstracted, and they look like cartoons. But there's a lot of continuity between the physical city and buildings and the metaverse. And I think that's very important, because we need to draw on our competency of quick navigating an urban space and recognizing situations, recognizing places, finding our way through places, because there's a certain spatial order, as I said, with maybe with the sense of a grids, axes, or primary and secondary path systems, etc. So we need to rely on this, recognizing the situations we're entering and understanding the built environment. We just replicate this so that we can easily find our way and have similar functionality in the metaverse. Now, metaverse has certain degrees of freedom where you can do a bit more. You can make them more transforming. You can, but for instance, gravity, you don't need it. You can say you don't need inside and outside, but in a way you need it inside and outside to express degree of openness, publicness, privacy versus privacy, etc. And that you layer it in with an open lobby and then a smaller, more private lobby. But also gravity, that you have a way of orienting and reading the space. You're not flying around like this, and you have people scattered in all directions, flying around the space. You don't know what's going on. They don't configure into a, you need to know, they're sitting at a table, can I join them? And so we need, so here's, I'm speaking about degrees of familiarity or replication, and then I think we can gradually develop variation, making things more kinetic, making things transparent, more responsive. You don't need all these columns, although columns sometimes also define spaces. So I'm not saying there wouldn't be any colonnades and or arches or vaults in the metaverse, because the vault gives you more of a convex sense, colonnades. So all these things might also play a role, not a structural role, but an articulation role, a space definition role. So we need to be quite conscious of that. And the more these metaverses initially really have to work well from day one and be used in businesses, you can't, it's not an artistic project where you play around and say, this is unusable. So what we have to do, we have to kind of first make them relatively literal, and then we experiment around with other things. We gradually introduce piecemeal, and they say, yeah, I mean, that works. And you can quickly get used to it. Now, for instance, in the metaverse, you're moving up on ramps and so on, and you're locked onto surfaces, but a bit of flying here and there or jumping down an atrium, you get used to it as a new capacity. So I think it will be quite quick that the metaverse, and that you get more used to maybe to things shifting and moving around you. So I'm very hopeful that we're gradually getting into quite a different condition. But initially what I'm saying is the metaverse has exactly the same functions and purposes. It's a total continuity of the social reality we live in. That's my metaverse I'm interested in. And that's so that we have that seminar we could have now in our Metrotopia design metaverse, and we can look at some of the models I'm talking about and experiencing them. We're working and educating and socializing in various contexts where you want to get to know new people, and you can then kind of connect up in the real world. So it's a continuum. That's my idea of metaverse. It's not some kind of video game fantasy where everything is different and nothing connects back, and you can instantiate yourself as a kind of, I don't know, fantasy figure. That's uninteresting to me. So if you think about the metaverse having this competing directly with physical spaces, you have schools of architecture want to do cyber physical campus. There are some universities where only online, but this kind of Zoom grid is getting boring and not so interesting. You can't have informal communication. You can't show things and so on and so forth. So they're directly competing with and pick up the same functionality from the physical spaces, or integrate and connect with them in a hybrid situation. That's why these things can't be dramatically different immediately.
Okay, thank you.
Lots of
Yeah.
to discuss.
Thank you so much, Patrik.
So that's why I'm also saying that this is architects, this is within our core competency to design these spaces, because they have the same criteria of success and functionality.
Thank you, Patrik. So we are running out of time.
Well, if there's one more question, I'm happy to kind of engage.
So before the end of this class, as you know, the industry of construction is actually moving lower than before in China. So, so young people is thinking seriously about their engagement in architecture. So at the end of this lecture, do you have any words to say to young students?
Well, I mean, as we talked about the metaverse, I mean, one thing is sure, there will be an avalanche of work. There will be so much work in terms of virtual spaces that you don't have to worry, even if the construction and urbanization in China is slowing down a little bit. By the way, it's compared to Europe and the US, it's still super fast moving. But you don't have to worry. I think for all of us, there will be so much work in terms of metaverse spaces, buildings, cities, because I think it has not begun yet, really. But I feel from what I've experienced and what we are able to do, it's compelling, the advantages of interacting in such spaces and displaying in that spaces and navigating many offerings of organizations is very strong. So I believe that, but you don't have network effects yet. So if nobody is there yet, then it's difficult. It's not yet as functioning and so on. So the thing is, how do you build up a group of early adopters, pioneers, to show the examples, and then once, then could it be super rapid? For me, it's a question, when this network effect kicks in, suddenly every single organization who has a building or website will want to have a virtual space, and they would also want to be located in one or several agglomerations or metaverse cities. And I think that's going to be so much, so interesting to develop. And there's going to be so much work that we actually need a lot of special tools, procedural, we have kind of these modular or procedural generation, algorithmic generation of buildings, elements, recombinations of modules to generate all these spaces, and AI, etc. We need all these tools to generate that amount of space, because remember, the whole world, all the buildings, people have buildings and so on, they suddenly need urgently virtual spaces, and then there will be more churning there. Then they would want to upgrade and they would change over and so on and so forth. The amount of design work. So we actually wouldn't be all swamped. We couldn't do it. So those of us who can do more equipped with computational tools to cope with this, including AI, we will get a lot of business. But I think there will also be a lot of self-generation. User-generated content with in-world builders is another thing, but these need to be designed. These systems of allowing users to plug and play spatial components to generate their spaces, a bit like you have website, you have organizations who commission professional web design firms and graphic designers. You have these kind of these tools where you self-made, they will also proliferate. Anyway, I think that's one thing I would recommend that to students, that they should invest in skills which are compatible with these challenges. But equally, these are all wonderful skills to have in the real world. And again, I want to emphasize, this is one discipline. This metaverse architecture and architecture, this is one, and from the design side of thing is one thing. From the engineering is a total swap of the engineering stack. But for the designer, it's totally seamless. As I said, we are doing a lot of designs. We can seamlessly throw them into the metaverse and make them functioning virtually. And at the moment, still the other way around. The other way around will be increasingly difficult. So I think on the designer's perspective, because we are in charge of the user interface, feel and look and usability and functionality, as actors, we can simulate this in VR and metaverse, but it's also directly usable, and there will be lots of digital twins. So I want to say this because don't think that if you focus on that you're no longer an architect. In my view, you are. Because it's a part of the core competency. Because if the core competency is ordering social interaction processes, then we're doing that. It could be virtual or physical, and we're doing that with in the 4 dimensions I was talking about: spatiology, phenomenology, semiology, and dramaturgy. They're equally valid and in both domains. So that's my final message.